Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. The smell of the hospital's sterilized water fills the air, mixing with the faint milky scent of a newborn to create a peculiar atmosphere. Martin stood in the corner of the delivery room, arms folded across his chest, not a smile on his face. His gaze traveled past his mother, Linda, and his mother-in-law, Dolores, who stood at the edge of the hospital bed, and landed on the radiant, but hardly tired, woman in the bed, his wife, Kristen. Kristen was holding a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket in her arms. Her face was filled with the joy and satisfaction of new motherhood, gazing down at the baby's sleeping face with a soft smile on her lips. Linda and Dolores were both filled with pride and happiness as they gathered around Kristen, left and right, and whispered their praises for the little one. The room is filled with a cozy atmosphere, but the coziness doesn't fit with Martin in the corner. He was like an outsider, calmly observing everything in front of him, with an imperceptible coldness hidden in the depths of his eyes. From time to time, Linda glanced over at her son, a hint of inquiry and imperceptible urgency in her eyes, as if wondering why he hadn't stepped forward, why he hadn't reached out and hugged the child he called his daughter. But she didn't say anything, perhaps because she didn't want to ruin this rare moment of joy. At that moment, the door to the ward was pushed open and a nurse came in with a file folder and a professional smile on her face. "Mr. Davis," the nurse looked to Martin. "Would you please fill out the birth certificate form?" Martin turned slowly, his face calm, but his eyes unusually determined. "We'll fill it out after the paternity test comes back and proves I'm the father." His voice was not loud, but like a stone thrown into a calm lake. It instantly stirred up 1,000 waves. Kristen's head snapped up, moving so fast it made the baby in her arms move. Her eyes widened in shock and her mouth dropped open as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Dolores drew in a breath of cold air and covered her chest under her hands, her face instantly turning white. Linda stiffened as well, her eyes darting quickly between her son and daughter-in-law, the smile on her face frozen. "Martin, how dare you say that?" Kristen's voice trembled with anger, and she questioned in a sharp tone, "Are you accusing me of cheating?" Martin met her rage-filled gaze without flinching. "No," his voice was cold and hard and clear, like steel hardened with ice. "I'm not accusing. I'm pretty sure you cheated. Now, I just have to make sure that this baby is mine or not." Dolores took a step forward, tension and anxiety written all over her face, her voice low but urgent. "Martin, this is not the time to talk about this. Kristen just had a baby, and you're doing this." She hesitates and looks over at a pale, breathing Kristen. "You're going to drive her into postpartum depression. Think of the baby." Linda, not as restrained as Dolores, drew in a sharp breath, shook with anger, and reached out a trembling finger to point at her son in fury. "You should be ashamed of yourself, blaming your wife at a time like this. How can you be so cruel and vicious? That's not how I taught you, Martin." Martin stood there, surrounded by the accusations of his two mothers and the hurt look in Kristen's eyes. Kristen's breathing became more and more erratic, and her arms tightened around the baby as if it were her only shield. She looked at him with tearful eyes, and then at the two elders who defended her, her eyes filled with fear and incredulity. He waited for their words to trail off before slowly raising his hand, signaling them to be quiet. His voice was steady, no anger could be heard, nor was there the slightest hesitation. "Kristen," he said word for word as his gaze locked on his wife's eyes. "Do you need me to call your lover, Marshall Jones?" Kristen's body jolted as if she'd been struck by an invisible whip. "What?" she blurted out, her face losing all color, and denied in horror. "No, I have nothing to do with him." Martin nodded slightly and pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. "Yeah," he said, slowly unfolding the piece of paper. "Then why did you send him such a message?" He read the paper out clearly. "My husband must never know about you and me. I don't want anything more to do with you." The room was dead silent, with only the monotonous beeps of the medical equipment echoing. The blood drained from Kristen's face and her body began to tremble uncontrollably. How did you get it?" Her voice trembled, and she asked with a sobbing voice. Martin let the note wobble freely in his fingers, met her tearful eyes, and said flatly, "He gave it to me. He sent me the screenshot." Kristen's body trembled violently. Her breathing became rapid and erratic, Her lips quivered. She held the baby tighter as fresh tears continued to well up from her eyes. Then she murmured, almost under her breath, in a broken and incredulous tone, "He said. He said no one would know." Her body trembled with sobs, and her tears rolled down like broken beads. Her lips parted as if to say something, but Martin didn't give her a chance to organize her thoughts. "So you did sleep with him," Martin said coldly, sounding like a sharp knife that cut through the tense air in the room. "And you're carrying his child." Kristen lets out a choked whimper and shakes her head frantically. But before she could open her mouth, Linda cut in, her voice sharp but pleading. "Martin, stop. It hasn't been proven that the baby isn't yours yet." Dolores, still in shock, rushed to agree, nodding vigorously. "Yeah, what if the baby's yours? You can't just assume the worst." Martin exhaled slowly, feeling the pain of months of silent suffering weighing heavily on his heart. His clenched fists unclenched again, trying to keep his voice calm and restrained. "I've known she was cheating for 4 months." He stated flatly, watching Kristen shrink violently. The reason he waited until the child was born was to do this paternity test. Kristen sucked in a breath of cold air and opened her eyes wider with tears. "You know," she whispered in a trembling voice. Martin ignored her and turned his attention to his mother and mother-in-law. "I want her to have a good, smooth pregnancy," he continued, "and I don't want her to be stressed or depressed. But now that the baby is born, it's time to face the truth." He took a deep breath and made a final declaration. "If the child is mine, I will do my duty as a father. If not, I wouldn't be involved in his life." Dolores let out a small cry, but Martin didn't pause. As for this woman, he cocked his head toward Kristen, who was crying silently. "I've had enough. She won't be my wife anymore. I'll make sure of that." A heavy silence enveloped the room. Linda wiped her hand across her face, looking exhausted, as if trying to figure out what she could say to change his mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Martin, the boy is innocent. He needs a father. It's too hard for a single mom to raise a child on her own." She hesitated for a moment, desperate hope in her eyes. "You should consider reconciliation and talk to a marriage counselor." Martin turned to his mother, his voice filled with suppressed anger. "And then what?" he asked pointedly. "Find out why my wife cheated on me? Sitting in a counseling room listening to a feminist therapist explain how I can't meet my wife's needs? Listening to her analyze why my wife became another man's mistress? And then, to hear someone tell me that my wife, who is pregnant with someone else's child, is right and justified in her behavior? And then I have to swallow my anger, pick up the pieces, accept this cheating wife, pretend I still love her, pretend that her cheating has instead ignited our love and made our relationship better than ever? You want me to willingly wear a green hat? You know what that means, don't you, Mom? Your son, a voluntary cuckold, is raising another man's child. Is that what you want me to be, Mom?" Linda's lips moved, trying to say something, but not a word came out. Martin took a step closer, his voice low and full of bitterness and incredulity. "You want me to suffer more? Are you really my mother? Or did you pick me up out of a garbage bag?" The room fell into complete silence. Linda's face turned pale and her mouth closed tightly. She didn't argue. She knew her son was right. Martin turns his attention to Dolores, who is holding onto Kristen's arm as if to stop her from having a complete meltdown. When she gets out of the hospital, his tone turned cold and determined. "Please take her back to your house. I have packed her clothes and all her belongings and will deliver them to your home or wherever you specify." With a casual gesture, he added, "But she, never to set foot in my house again." Kristen lets out a low sob, her face buried in her hands, but he refuses to look at her. She didn't deserve his sympathy. He turned to his mother, who had not yet spoken. "You can do whatever you want," he told her. "I won't force you to make any decisions. I know you and Dolores have been friends since you were little, and I don't want my unfaithful wife's behavior to ruin your friendship." His voice hardened. "I don't force anything on you, so don't force anything on me either." He let the silence continue for a moment, then slowly and clearly repeated himself. "As I said before, if the child were mine, I would be his father. If not, you will never be able to force me into a relationship that constantly reminds me of my wife's betrayal." When he finished, he turned toward the door. As he neared the door, he caught a glimpse of the nurse who had been standing there, silently witnessing the chaos. Their eyes met, and for a moment he saw a hint of sympathy in her eyes. That night, Martin was sitting alone in his empty house when his cell phone rang. "It's from my mother, Linda." He sighed, having guessed the purpose of the call. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up. Linda's voice is soft but firm. "Son, I don't agree with everything Kristen has done," she cracked. "But in this moment, she needs me and Dolores. I'm at her place now and will be here to help them." Martin clenched his teeth and rubbed his temples. He had expected his mother to go, but hearing the news still left him with a bad taste in his mouth. "I've treated her like a daughter since I was a little girl," Linda continues, "and I couldn't just turn off that emotion all at once." She paused as if weighing her next words, then sighed. "Now I don't know if the baby is yours, but I'll pray to God that he is. I also pray that you will find a way to save this marriage." That's the bottom line. Martin couldn't take it anymore. He gripped his cell phone and interrupted his mother. "Mom, this marriage is over." His voice was firm and unquestioning. "Even if the baby is mine, I'm done with her. Don't mention it again." "Martin." He wouldn't let her finish. "If you want to keep setting us up, consider your son dead." Do I make myself clear? There was silence on the other end of the line. It was followed by a small, helpless sigh. "I hear you," she murmured. Martin didn't say another word and hung up. 2 days later, Martin proved his determination with his actions. His attorney served Kristen with divorce papers. Whatever illusions she may have had about repairing the relationship were shattered at that moment. He has canceled all her credit cards, emptied the joint accounts, taken his portion, and left her share. Jointly invested assets are frozen until the divorce and property division is finalized. That afternoon, his cell phone rang again. A quick glance at the caller ID shows that it's the mother. He took a deep breath and prepared himself for another round of lectures. As soon as the call was answered, Linda opened her mouth without delay, her voice filled with disappointment, almost trembling. "You shouldn't have done that. She's not fully recovered, and you're doing this to her. Martin, I'm so ashamed of you. I never thought you'd be so cold and heartless." Martin closes his eyes and presses his fingers against the bridge of his nose. His patience is running out. "Cold and heartless," he repeated, his voice low but filled with suppressed anger. And where was her heart when she opened her legs to another man? Was she thinking with her heart at that time? There was silence on the other end of the line. Martin continued to press, his voice sharpening with each word. Did she think about her marriage when she decided to betray me? Any thoughts on her husband? He leaves these questions hanging in the air and gives mothers time to digest them. "You know the answer, Mom. So stop blaming me for her behavior. I'm just doing what I'm told." She still did not say anything. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the phone, but she was powerless to refute it. "Stop accusing me," he continued, his tone turning cold and determined, "or I'm going to start holding you accountable for your behavior now." After saying that, he hung up the phone and threw it on the passenger seat of the car. 3 days later, the results of the paternity test came out. Despite his premonition, Martin's hand trembled slightly the moment he opened the envelope. Exclusion of parent-child relationships. He exhaled slowly and stared at the paper for a long time, a complex of emotions welling up in his heart. There is no relief, only a sense of finality as the dust settles. Any lingering doubts, any hint of wondering if you are being too harsh, dissipate in an instant. He folded the report neatly, stuffed it back into the envelope, and grabbed the car keys. Then he drove to Dolores' house. About 30 minutes later, Martin arrived at the Dolores door. He got out of the car, took a deep breath, and stabilized his mind. This moment will change everything, not only for him, but for everyone involved. He knocked on the door, and a few seconds later it opened. Kristen stood in the doorway, and when she saw him, her face instantly lit up with a mixture of relief, hope, and a hint of self-assured confidence. "You came to me," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "I knew you loved me, and that you would reconsider." She gave a small, almost triumphant smile. "I was just telling Mom that you'd be back. I know you can't live without me." She took a step forward and held out her arms as if expecting a hug. Martin held out a hand to stop her approach. "Stop acting," he said in a firm, unshakable voice. "Where's your mother?" "I'm coming for her. Go get her out." The light of hope in her eyes flickered for a moment, then dimmed. Her smile froze, and she took a hesitant step back. It was the first time he'd seen her look so uncertain. "Oh," she murmured, hesitating for a moment, then sidestepped out of the way. "Come in." Martin walked in, his footsteps sounding hollow in the silence of the house. A few moments later, Dolores emerges from the hallway, but she's not alone. His mother, Linda, followed her, holding the baby in her arms. Linda's eyes lit up when she saw her son, her face filled with eager hope. She came toward him with the baby in her arms, lurching gently. "You see," she said with a smile, "the boy's eyes look like yours. He really looks like you." She took another step forward. "Here, hug him, just a little, and I promise you'll forget all about it. You will be a happy family again." Martin took a step back. "Mom, that's enough," he said, his tone firm, his patience exhausted. "Stop pushing me." Linda froze, looking at him confused and sad. "I told you to stop trying to force me to accept it," he continued, his voice cold as ice. Then, without further ado, he pulled that envelope out of his pocket and handed it to Dolores. "Please read it out loud," he said, making sure his voice was steady, "so everyone in the room can hear it." Dolores took the document with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the text above, her lips slightly parted, and her voice was hollow as she read. "Sample, probability of paternity 0%. You are not his father." She let out a sharp breath, as if struck by the truth, and then dropped into a chair, pressing her hand to her forehead. Silence hangs over the room like a thick fog, suffocating, and there is no escape. Linda, still holding the baby, reached for the report. She stared for a long time, her lips moving silently, as if she were silently reading the words to herself. Then, almost in slow motion, she too sank into a chair. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice breaking. Martin let the silence last a few more seconds, letting the weight of the truth weigh down on them. Then he opened his mouth, in an icy tone, without the slightest remnant of patience. "I'm just here to tell you two to stop bothering me with this kid. Now you have proof." His gaze swept over them, the mother still holding her baby, Dolores still holding her hands over her head in disbelief. "Like I said long ago, since this child is not mine, I will not be involved in his life." He turned to his mother and looked at her with a look that held all his weariness and bitterness. "Mom, I hope you're satisfied now," he said, with a final determination in his voice. "And even if you're not, I don't care. This child is not your grandson. It was your so-called beloved daughter who took that away from you." He gestured toward Kristen, who stood there in tears. "Never, ever force me to be the father of this child again." He turned, his feet already moving toward the door. He's had enough here. But just as his hand was about to touch the doorknob, his mother's voice cut through the silence. "Martin, wait." He stopped, but didn't look back. He heard her rise from her chair, her steps slow and determined. Then her voice, a little softer now, reached him clearly. "Take me home." Martin turns around just in time to see his mother hand the baby back to Kristen. Kristen's face crumpled into a frown as she clutched the baby tightly to her chest. Next, Linda turned to Dolores, the weight of her decision clearly embodied in her gesture. "I'm sorry," she said, regret in her voice. "I was holding on to the one-in-a-million hope that this child would be my grandson, but she has shattered all my hopes." She paused for a moment, her eyes darting between Dolores and Kristen. "You're my best friend, always have been. I understand that you need to be there for your daughter right now, but I need to be there for my son too." Dolores stands up and walks slowly toward Linda. There was no anger on her face, no resentment, only understanding. She opened her arms and Linda stepped into them. "Semper Fi," Dolores whispered. Linda responded, "Always faithful, sister. Ever faithful, sister." Linda walked ahead of him, her posture stiff but determined. She didn't look back, she just got into the car and sat down in the passenger seat without saying a word. Martin followed him into the car, closed the door, and started the engine. There was silence on the way home. He could feel his mother moving slightly in her seat, glancing at him now and then. But she said nothing, and he didn't ask. When she arrived at her mother's house, she got out of the car first and walked into the house without closing the door. Martin hesitated and followed. As soon as he stepped through the door, the familiar smells of home surrounded him: coffee, old books, and the faint scent of the lavender candle she kept lit in the living room. She walked into the kitchen without a word. He heard the sound of a cupboard door opening and closing, the slight clink of a spoon against a glass. A few minutes later, she walked out with a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. She added chocolate, just the way he likes it. His throat tightened a little as he held the warm mug in both hands and gazed at the dark liquid inside. She sat down beside him and sighed softly. After a while, she opened up. "I'm sorry, son." Her voice was soft and full of remorse. He glanced at her, but she didn't look at him, instead looking down at her hands, her fingers lightly tracing the palm lines. "I was wrong," she continued. "I was selfish. I never wanted to see you and Kristen split up, but I was wrong. Forgive me." Martin takes a deep breath and sets down his glass. He knows the words won't be easy for her. "I know you and Dolores have been friends since we were kids," he said in a low, firm voice. "And I know why you're rooting for Kristen, but that's too much for me, Mom. I don't have anyone around me, no one to support me." Then, without warning, all the pent-up emotions finally crushed him. His chest tightened and his vision blurred. His breathing became short and sharp, and the emotional dam he'd worked so hard to build over the past few months collapsed in an instant. He's crashing. Tears fell on his hands, and his shoulders shook violently. He tried to speak, but could not make any sound. Then he felt his mother's hand, warm and steady, over his. "And me?" She moved closer, stroking his hair as she had done as a child, her touch carrying a reassuring familiarity. "You're doing well," she whispered. "You're strong. You stuck to your beliefs. You haven't wavered, not once. Even when I was rooting for Kristen, you didn't fall apart." She gripped his hand tightly, her voice filled with something he hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm proud of you, son." His mother's words still linger in Martin's mind. Her apology, her pride in him, and the way she finally chose to stand by him. But something else caught his attention, something unexpected. "Semper Fi?" he asked, looking at his mother. "You said this when you hugged Dolores. What does that mean?" Mother smiled, a small, knowing smile, and she shook her head slightly, as if brushing away an old memory. "Oh, nothing," she said, with a nostalgic lilt in her voice. "We used to be in the Marines. We both fought in the first Gulf War. There were 40,000 women soldiers in that war, and we were two of them. Then we came back and retired. And then I had you." Martin blinked, a little taken aback. "You never said that." He watched his mother's face carefully. She laughed softly and shrugged her shoulders. "We're in logistical support, nothing exciting." But there was something in her tone, something in her eyes about the unseen past that made him think it might not be that simple. Her eyes drifted to her father's framed picture on the bookshelf, and a softness appeared on her face. "Your father was an amazing man," she murmured. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away as if she didn't want it to stay. Then, as if snapping back to her senses, she straightened her body, raised her shoulders, and stood up. "I'll go make you something to eat." Her voice resumed its usual warmth. Martin nodded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. She got busy in the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time there was no tension between them. They sat together, ate quietly, and let the silence speak to the emotions that needed no words. After dinner, Martin stood up and stretched slightly. "Thanks, Mom," he said. She reached out and took his hand in a firm grip, then loosened it. "Anytime, son." With that, Martin left and drove home. The divorce case dragged on longer than he expected. Kristen decided to fight the divorce. Martin filed a petition for divorce on the grounds of adultery. The judge, a sharp-eyed older woman with a serious expression, seems to be more critical of Martin's stance than she is of Kristen. It was obvious from the start that she didn't quite agree with his approach. "Mr. Campbell," the judge said, disapproval in his voice, "it appears that you are trying to evade your responsibility. Marriage is a commitment, and children, regardless of their conception, deserve stability." Martin kept his face impassive, but inside he was seething with anger. Responsibility? Stabilization? Where was that concern when his wife was sneaking around behind his back? Fortunately, his attorney, Ron Jeremy, was well prepared. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Your Honor," Ron said, flipping through the papers in front of him. "With all due respect, my client is not throwing in the towel. He just refuses to take up responsibilities that do not belong to him. The child is not his. We have the paternity report to prove it. As for marriage, I am not the one who broke the vows. Mrs. Campbell had an affair with her colleague Marshall Jones, and we have ample evidence that this was not an impulsive one-time mistake, but an ongoing betrayal. Kristen shifted in her seat, but tried to keep a composed expression. When it was her turn to testify, she put on a performance worthy of a movie queen. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I was lonely. Martin is always traveling for work and is gone for weeks at a time. I feel like a single woman, as if I have no husband at all. Marshall came along and listened to me and understood my situation. I know I made a mistake, but I didn't mean to hurt Martin." Martin gritted his teeth and resisted the urge to snort. She portrays herself as the victim of all this. "Did you continue to see Mr. Jones after you found out you were pregnant?" Ron asked, his tone flat. Kristen shook her head rapidly. "No. When I found out I was pregnant, I cut off all contact with him. I want to save my marriage." Martin glanced at Ron, who remained impassive. They had the evidence in hand: text messages, emails, call logs. They knew she was lying. "So you've had no contact with him since?" Ron asked a follow-up question. "No," Kristen repeated, her voice firm. Ron sighed, then pulled out a stack of printed papers and held them up. "Your Honor, Exhibit C, correspondence between Mrs. Campbell and Mr. Jones during her pregnancy. As you can see, not only has she been in contact with him, but she has confided in him about her feelings, her plans, and even expressed doubts about whether or not to tell my client the truth." Kristen's face paled slightly. "That doesn't mean I slept with him again." She took her mouth off. "Maybe not," Ron admitted, "but it does prove that you're still emotionally connected to him despite being married. You claim to have severed the relationship, but the evidence is to the contrary." Kristen's lips pursed into a line as she glanced at the judge, who was frowning and studying the papers thoughtfully. But then Kristen changed tactics. "I was lonely," she says, her voice softening again, "and I felt neglected. I'm not actively looking for this, Your Honor. It was Marshall who pursued me. He seduced me. I gave in because I was weak, because I was hurting inside. What can I do when my own husband is not around?" The judge's expression changed slightly. She nodded, as if digesting Kristen's words, as if wanting to agree with her. Ron turns to Kristen, and there's a hint of edge in his voice that suggests he's about to dismantle her arguments one by one. "Mrs. Campbell," he began, his tone steady but firm, "I heard what you said. Your husband's not home, and you're needy." He purposely dragged out the last word so that the implication would be profound. Kristen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Let's clear something up," Ron continued. "You claim Martin neglected you, right?" Kristen hesitated for a moment. Her lips pursed, then answered, "Yes." Ron nodded as if he had expected that answer. "And have you ever told your husband that his job puts a strain on your marriage? Have you ever sat him down and told him, 'Martin, this is not going to work. I need you to give more'?" She didn't say anything. Martin could see her mind racing, trying to find an answer that wouldn't disadvantage her further. But the web of excuses she had woven was beginning to unravel, and she had nothing to say. "Mrs. Campbell," Ron pressed on, "you paint a picture. Your husband is away on a business trip and you are alone. Meanwhile, Mr. Jones appears, listens to you, comforts you, praises you, and cares for you. His words are full of irony. But tell me, doesn't your husband care about you?" Kristen remained silent. "Your husband never praised you?" Ron asked a follow-up question. Still no answer. Ron turns to the judge and holds up a couple of printouts. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw your attention to Mr. Campbell's social media accounts. Here are multiple examples of him taking his wife out to dinner, sharing heartfelt posts about her, and even getting her surprise gifts. These don't look like the kind of things a husband who neglects his wife would do." He looks back to Kristen. "So, let me ask a very direct question. Mrs. Campbell, is your infidelity your husband's fault? Yes or no?" Kristen gritted her teeth. She looks at the judge, at Ron, and at Martin. Finally, she muttered in a weak voice, "No." Ron let the word hang in the air for a moment, then took a step forward, his voice sharpening. "You know, Mrs. Campbell," he said, "I've been listening to you for nearly 2 hours. Not once have you taken responsibility for your actions. Not once have you admitted your mistakes. Not once have you said you were sorry. Instead, you blame your husband for everything that is not going well in your life. But what I can't understand is if Martin is such a failure in your eyes, if he's such a terrible husband, why are you fighting for reconciliation? Why force a man you cheated to raise a child he had nothing to do with, a child you and Jones had first? Ron straightened his tie, stepped forward, and addressed the judge with the confidence of someone who knew he was about to make an irrefutable argument. Your Honor, let's take a good look at Mr. Campbell, he began, gesturing toward Martin, who, according to his wife, is negligent in caring for his family and a pathetic husband who doesn't care about his wife's feelings. She claimed that he was running away from his responsibilities as a father. In short, she wants us to believe that he's a loser. Martin exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of those words. Kristen sat stiffly, arms crossed, her eyes darting between the judge and Ron. So, Your Honor, Ron continued, should a woman continue to live with such a man? Should she stay with someone she thinks is such a failure? Or should she be with Mr. Jones, the man who she claims is caring and considerate and who, according to her, is the real father of this child? Kristen's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint sound of the stenographer's pen scratching across the paper. I would like to remind the court that we have not yet confirmed through paternity testing whether Mr. Jones is indeed the father of this child. We are only basing ourselves on Mrs. Campbell's words at this point. Ron, let that sink in and let the meaning sink in. Considering that Mrs. Campbell had told my client that this child was his, and that has been proven to be a lie, I think we can all agree that her word alone is not credible. Kristen shrinks violently, her head turning to Ron. No, she blurted out, her voice trembling a little. Marshall is the father. Ron turned to her and raised one eyebrow. Mrs. Campbell, you said the same thing to my client, and we both know how that turned out. He shrugged. Forgive me for saying so, but I'm afraid we're going to need more than just your assurance this time. Kristen looks down at her hand, her face pale. But let's not get into that. Ron continues fluidly. Let's get back to the original question. If my client is as bad as Mrs. Campbell says he is, if he is truly negligent, callous, and a bad example to his child, then why is he involved in this child's life? Why would she force him to play the role of a father to a child that is not his own? The judge's expression changed, and Martin could see the gears turning in her head. Ron approached the bench, his voice steady and calm. Your Honor, we have established that Mrs. Campbell cheated on her husband, had a child with someone else, and has portrayed my client as an unfit husband and father throughout the case. If that's true, then why does she want to reconcile? Why would you want a loser like him to be responsible for a child that doesn't belong to him? The courtroom was silent, and all eyes were on Kristen, waiting for her answer. Kristen's sudden outburst shocked the entire courtroom. She jerked up from her seat, her voice hoarse with despair. He's the best husband ever, she screamed, tears streaking down her cheeks. I love him. I want him to stay in my life. My boy couldn't have had a better father than him. The room was silent for a moment. The woman who betrayed him, lied to him, and humiliated him is now declaring her eternal love in front of everyone. This is almost laughable. Almost. Ron, always professional, never missed a beat. He leans forward, and his voice is calm but penetrating. Then what? He questioned. Why, Mrs. Campbell? Why did you betray him? Why break his heart? Kristen's face contorted in pain, and her whole body trembled. She tried to speak, but her voice was choked and broken. Eventually, she sobbed and cried out. It was a time of burning desire. I want to have sex, that's all. There was a low murmur in the courtroom. Even the judge's expression flickered with an unspeakable emotion. Disgust, disappointment, maybe both. Kristen collapsed in her chair, face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking violently. The judge sighed, rubbed his temples, and then opened his mouth. Mrs. Campbell, that's enough. You can go down now. Kristen didn't move at first, as if she hadn't heard. Then, slowly, she stood up and stumbled back to her seat, her body convulsing with silent sobs. Adjournment. The trial will be held in 2 weeks. The judge declared as the gavel hit the wooden block. 2 weeks later, Martin was back in the same courtroom, sitting on the same heavy wooden bench, with the same dull hum of people in the air. But this time, there were no dramatic outbursts, no pleas or tears, only a cold sense of finality that settled in his chest like a stone. The judge looks at the lawyers for both sides, and then turns to Martin. Her eyes were calm, her voice firm. Mr. Martin Campbell, are you willing to reconcile with your wife? Martin took a deep breath and let the question sink in. He glanced at Kristen, who sat motionless beside her attorney, her eyes red and swollen, but no longer tearful. A part of him wished he could feel something: anger, regret, even pity, but there was nothing left. Not willingly, Your Honor. His voice was steady and unshakable. The judge nodded once, then raised his gavel. In that case, this court pronounces a judgment of dissolution of the marriage. The community property will be divided on a 50-50 basis and distributed to the parties accordingly. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. That was it. It was all over for him. But he's wrong. It's over for him, not for Kristen. Moving out of that house was easier than he thought. He doesn't have any attachment to that place anymore. It had become a pile of walls filled with memories he no longer wanted to recall. Without hesitation, he sold his house and moved into a small apartment near his office. Not a big place, but enough. A new beginning, or at least the closest thing to a new beginning. A few weeks after moving into the new house, my mother called. She sounded a little hesitant and carefully worded. Martin, I just want you to know that I'm going to help Dolores with the kids. Kristen, she's not doing well. She was diagnosed with depression and is being treated for it. Martin leaned back on the couch and rubbed his face with his hand. A part of him did feel something, perhaps sympathy, but not enough to make him forget what she did. He wasn't stone-hearted, but he wasn't going to wallow in guilt over what had happened to her, either. Okay, he simply said. You're not mad? She asked carefully. He shook his head, even though she couldn't see it. No, Mom, it's okay. The child is innocent in all this. If Dolores needs help and you want to help her, I won't stop it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she opened her mouth again. Have you thought about Marshall? Ever think about what he did? Martin exhaled slowly, already knowing what she wanted to say. Mom, let's get one thing straight. It wasn't Marshall who ruined my marriage. It was Kristen. She's the one who decided to cheat. No one forced her. She made that choice herself. I know, she admitted. But aren't you angry? That man had a hand in it. Of course I'm angry, Martin said, his voice quiet but firm. I don't deny that I did have violent thoughts about him in the beginning, but I'm not going to ruin my life over it. I'm not going to get my hands dirty for someone who doesn't deserve it. So you just let it go? An imperceptible sneer swept across the corners of Martin's mouth. Not exactly. I anonymously sent the details of our divorce, including evidence of him being a third party, to his company. They are less inclined to hire a man who is having an affair with a married coworker. He was dismissed. Mother was silent for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. Well, I guess it's better than breaking his nose. And much cleaner. Martin shrugged. That was the last time they talked about Marshall Jones. 3 years have passed. Life, as usual, moves on. Martin keeps himself busy and slowly rebuilds his confidence, routine, and self-awareness. He dated occasionally, but did not develop a serious relationship. The idea of commitment, of trusting someone again, feels like an impossible task. Every time he starts to get close to someone, he backs off and pulls away before things get complicated. He's not resentful, he's not broken, but he's not ready. It was a quiet evening. He had just finished dinner and was considering whether to pour himself a glass of wine when his cell phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Dolores. It was a surprise. He hesitated before answering. Hello. She didn't waste any time. Martin, come to my house. We need to talk. Her tone was firm, almost non-negotiable. He sighed, already feeling the weight of the conversation that awaited him. Dolores, I don't think. No, it's not about Kristen, she interrupted, as if she expected his reluctance. It's something else. It didn't make him feel any better. He doesn't like surprises, and he especially doesn't like surprises from anyone connected to his past. Dolores, I really don't think. Before he could finish, he heard another voice in the background. Martin, come see us. It was her mother's voice, and she took the phone from Dolores. Her voice was gentle, but with an undeniable firmness. I'm here too. Martin took a deep breath and raked his hand through his hair. If it was just Dolores, he might have turned down the request, but his mother's presence changed things. Well, he muttered, I'll be there in a minute. He hung up the phone, picked up his keys, and walked out, an uneasy premonition weighing heavily on his chest. The road to Dolores' house is quiet, but his mind kept circling. Why did she call him over so suddenly? Why does the mother sound so serious? He parked in front of the house, got out, and knocked on the door. The mother opened the door first, and she looked at him for a long time before sidling up to let him in. Upon entering the house, he saw Dolores standing by the couch. She nodded softly to him, but before he could say anything, a little boy ran toward him and stopped at his legs. "Who are you?" The little boy tilted his head in curiosity. Martin smiled and crouched down slightly to level with him. "You see that lady over there?" He pointed to his mother. "I'm her son." The little boy nodded, his little face scrunching up as if digesting the information. "Oh," he said, as if everything was clear. "You are her son. Nice to meet you." Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and ran away again. Martin stands up and walks over to Dolores. She gave him a short hug without delay. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady but with a heaviness he couldn't quite describe. He barely had time to respond before his mother handed him a cup. He looked down at the amber-colored liquid inside, then raised his eyebrows at his mother. "This," she met his gaze calmly. "You're going to need it when we're done talking." It didn't relax him. He takes the glass, but doesn't drink right away, watching Dolores sit down and signaling him to do the same. He sank into the chair, the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach growing. Dolores took a deep breath and opened her mouth. "Listen, your ex-wife, Kristen, she's dead." The words hit him like a slow-moving boulder, not out of sadness, but because he was totally unprepared to hear the news. His eyes lock on Dolores' face, trying to find more information. What's going on?" he asked, his voice softer than he expected. Sorrow came to Dolores' face. Last week, she was involved in a serious boating accident while on vacation in Florida. Her voice was low and heavy. The storm came so suddenly that their ship capsized. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage, but neither she nor Marshall made it back. Martin sat up straight in surprise. "Her and Marshall?" Dolores nods slowly. "They're back together, hiding it from everyone. They went on that vacation together and wanted a fresh start. And there was that accident." The room was silent. Martin is trying to digest the news. Though his relationship with Kristen had long been broken, hearing of her death still left him with a shock and a tinge of mixed emotions. He remembers the woman who crumbled in court and the times they had, even though those times have been tainted by betrayal. "I'm sorry to hear that," he finally said, though his words were pale. He wasn't happy about her death, but he couldn't fake extreme grief either. "Tim." Martin's eyes drifted in the direction the boy had just left. "That's why we called you here," Dolores said, looking at him anew, her gaze firm and earnest. "Now that Tim's an orphan, Marshall's family won't take it over. You know, his parents died a long time ago, and he doesn't have any relatives." "Kristen's parents." Martin tries to talk, but Dolores interrupts him. "They're too old and too sick to raise a child," Dolores said, her voice filled with worry. "And, to be honest, they're disappointed in Kristen, in this child. Feelings are complicated." Silence descended again. Martin began to understand their request. "Martin," Linda began, her voice gentle but pleading. "This child is innocent. He needs a home." Martin gazed into his glass of whiskey, his thoughts abounding. "I know what you want me to do," he said slowly. "But you also know that the child is not mine." "Yes, we know," Dolores acknowledged with a nod. "But he's got no one now. And you're a good man, Martin. You have a stable job and can afford to provide a home for him." Martin looked up, his eyes darting between the two older women. This request is too sudden, too heavy. They want him to adopt a child who is not related to him, a reminder of what was once his greatest source of pain. "I need time to think about it," he said, though his first reaction was to decline. Dolores grabbed a folder from her side and handed it to him. "I've transferred most of my assets into your name," she said, "and some left by Kristen. It's all earmarked for you to raise Tim, too." Martin took the folder and felt its weight. It's not just the weight of paper, it's the future of an innocent child, a child orphaned by no choice of his own. Regardless of how he feels about Kristen and Marshall, Tim is innocent. "I'm not in it for the money," he said, his voice a little rough. "I need time to think. This is a big decision." They nodded in understanding. Martin stood up and didn't drink the glass of whiskey this time. "I'll be in touch," he said, and turned to leave. On the way home, his mind was filled with complex thoughts. The request disrupts his carefully rebuilt life and brings him face to face with memories and emotions he's tried to avoid for the past 3 years. This baby is Kristen's, it's Marshall's, it's the product of that betrayal. But he is also an innocent child who has now lost his parents and needs a home. Martin sits alone in his apartment, contemplating his options. He could have refused and moved on with his life, leaving the fate of this child in the hands of the social welfare system or other relatives. But as he considers this option, certain moments of memory come back to him. The loneliness of his own childhood, the pain of his father's untimely death, and the strength of his mother's efforts to raise him to adulthood. He remembered his quest for vengeance. He wins. Kristen loses everything. Marshall loses his job and his reputation, and ultimately, they lose their lives, though that wasn't his intention. But the satisfaction he gets from revenge is short-lived and hollow. Now a whole new direction is presented to him. To prove his character not by punishing others, but by caring for an innocent child. Perhaps this is true victory, not destroying, but rebuilding, not rejecting, but accepting, not hating, but transcending hate. Accepting Tim isn't about forgiving Kristen and Marshall for what they did. It's about demonstrating his inner strength and generosity and proving that he's truly let go of past resentments. Waking up the next morning, Martin realizes he has made his decision. He picked up the phone and dialed Dolores' number. "I'll pick Tim up," he said simply, without much explanation, without hesitation. "I'll take care of him." That afternoon, he stood in front of the Dolores house and watched Tim's small figure walk toward him with a somewhat large backpack. There was both fear and hope in the boy's eyes. Martin crouched down to his level. "Hi, Tim," he said gently. "I know this is all very difficult for you. I've lost my father too, so I know what it's like." He paused to make sure the boy understood his words. "Would you like to come and live with me? I'll take care of you the best I can." Tim asked in that direct way that only a child can. "Will you be my new daddy?" Martin felt his throat tighten. The issue is so simple and so complex. "If you want," he replied, his voice steady and sincere. "I'll try to be a good father." Tim thinks for a moment, then nods. "Good." The simple acceptance in his voice melted Martin's heart a little. He said. That night, after settling Tim into his new room, Martin stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. Once again, his life changed forever, but this time it was a choice he made of his own accord. Not for revenge, not to hurt, but to heal the hurt of an innocent child, and perhaps in the process, to heal his own. In a way, it's his ultimate victory over Kristen, not by making her suffer, but by showing the character and strength she failed to possess in her absence. He would give Tim a loving home, a stable environment, a life that neither she nor Marshall could ultimately provide. It wasn't the path he had planned for his life, but it would be his choice. His revenge is complete, and now it's time to start a new chapter. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.